Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. I'm your host, Brian, and today I'm here with Gavin Cox, which I've never had on my channel today. So this is the first time he's ever been on this channel. He's from Answers in Genesis in the UK. He's got a master's in Egyptology, which is very uh, convenient given the fact that in today's program, we're going to be talking about the Egyptian chronology and the biblical timeline because skeptics and critics have often thrown up this is a very common objection to the global flood, to the biblical timeline, and say, well, no, that can't be because of that the Egyptian chronology would be contradictory to the flood timeline and the biblical timeline. So we're going to be talking about that objection today, Gavin has a presentation for us too. And I'm not going to get too much in. I had an introduction for Gavin, but Gavin said he has all that in his a slide. So we're going to let him sit there and do that introduction. So I will be monitoring the chat while he's giving the presentation. Please, if you have any kind of questions, we're going to try to leave room at the end for a Q&A so that you guys can be able to ask some questions of Gavin and discuss this. Following the discussion portion, which will follow the presentation. So, Gavin, do you have anything to start with, or do you want to go ahead and jump into your presentation?
Well, I'd just like to say a big hello to your audience, Brian. Thanks very much for having me. It's lovely to be invited on your show, and I hope your audience gets something out of tonight. I'm sure they will. So we're going to be thinking about Egyptian chronology. What is chronology? How do you start and form a chronology? And how does it fit in with biblical chronology? What is a biblical chronology? Does the Bible even have a chronology? So we're going to be thinking about some fundamental things tonight. What is time? What is history? What is chronology? And why it's important.
Absolutely. All right. If you want to, go ahead and start your presentation, and we can go ahead and jump right into it.
Okay, let's go and share my screen. So this is always the slightly nervous part. So, do you see my Answers in Genesis cover slide?
Yes, I do. I'm going to
Good.
go ahead and take me off and let you take it away.
Okay, right. So, speaking from Answers in Genesis UK, and this is my talk tonight, resolving the chronology conundrum. So, it's biblical versus Egyptian history. So, what is chronology and why does it matter for Christians? So let's start with the basics. Chronology is defined as the arrangement of events or dates in the order of their occurrence. And this involves the study of historical records to establish the dates of past events. And did you know that the Bible's full of chronological information? That's important because it separates the narratives of the Bible from the myths of other ancient cultures. Without the dates and sequences of events, the narratives of the Bible would be reduced to, once upon a time, or a just so story, unmoored from historical reality. So that's what we're going to be thinking about tonight. And as Brian promised, I'll introduce myself to you. Originally, I'm a Camborne School of Mines graduate, so I studied minerals engineering, and that eventually got me into the oil industry. So I was working all over the world for looking for oil and gas. Later, I did an honours degree in theology. I was at London Bible College. And then later, I did a master's degree in biblical studies. That's at my home city of Exeter University. Got introduced to ancient Egypt by a guy called Robert Morcott. He was the professor of Egyptology there and wrote a very influential book that really punched a hole in the regular Egyptian chronology. And interestingly enough, he was far more open to the Bible as a historical, worthwhile document than a lot of the professors in the biblical studies department, because they tied their biblical chronology to an old view of Egyptian chronology, which they saw through rose glasses, as it were. But this Egyptologist recognized the weakness of Egyptian chronology and recognized, well, yes, it can be compressed in certain parts. And if you do it in certain parts, according to the evidence, it lines up beautifully with the Bible. So let's think about the Bible timeline. The Bible contains chronological information, and that cannot be disputed. So what chronology is from Latin chronologia, and from ancient Greek chronos, which means time, and logia means to write down. So that's the science of arranging events in their order of occurrence in time. So biblical chronology spans from creation in the Old Testament to the beginning of the church age in the New Testament, as this diagram on the screen shows. Basically, we live in AD time, which means Anno Domini, or Latin for in the year of the Lord. So from the conventional year one, that's 2026 years from AD 1. We probably evidence that Christ was born 4 BC, but we go for the conventional year 1. So BC time, that's before Christ, and these dates are imposed on history, as obviously this chronological scheme did not exist for those who lived before Christ. So the greater the BC dates, the older it is, working backwards as opposed to forwards in time. So some basic outlines, basic thinking for our audience tonight to think about BC and AD and what is chronology. So what can and often has been disputed by secularists and skeptical Christians is whether or not biblical chronological information has any real value, and either theologically or historically. For instance, as I should discuss in this talk, secularists have challenged and dismissed all of the primeval history from creation. And let's have a look. The patriarchs, they've challenged Abraham or Moses. They've challenged whether the Exodus ever happened, whether Israel ever came out of Egypt, or Joshua's conquest of Canaan, the period of the Judges, even whether David and Solomon even existed. And this is quite typical of university-level biblical studies, that all of these things are out the window. But it's my conviction, as many others, that the Bible does contain reliable and divinely inspired chronology and history, and that's extremely important for us both theologically and historically. So let's start with brass tacks, shall we? Get to the basics. Did you know that Jesus Christ accepted the chronology and history of the Bible from creation up to his own time as revealed by God to Moses? So Genesis as real history, starting with Adam and Eve, made at the beginning of creation, not at the end of billions of years of evolutionary time, as this diagram shows. Accepting evolution and billions of years means rejecting biblical history for humankind and civilization, and questioning the authority of Jesus Christ as well. So Jesus said here, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? So red, I've marked in red there, referring to Moses' writings. Jesus always treated Moses as authoritative, and Moses gave us the account of creation. Humans were made in God's image at the end of creation week on day 6. God rested on day 7. So that's right there at the beginning of creation, not at the end of billions of years of evolutionary process, including death and bloodshed and suffering. These things theologically came after the fall. They weren't part of God's natural order. So placing billions of years before the fall means death before sin, even sin before sin. If you look at the human fossil record and place that before Adam and Eve. So it has really serious implications for us, history and chronology. If you don't get your history and chronology right, it rips apart the authority of the Bible, its theology, even the words of Jesus Christ. For instance, in Luke 11:50, Jesus said, "So that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation from the blood of Abel." So here Jesus accepts as historical the timeline of prophets from Abel, that's Adam and Eve's first son, to his own day, based on Genesis as real history as faithfully recorded by Moses. Is another example, Jesus accepting Moses' history as real when it comes to the flood as global. So for as were the days of Noah, Jesus said in Matthew 24, verses 37 to 39, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Jesus treated it as real history. Noah, the flood, real events, real people. A global flood. God judged sin globally. Jesus is saying God will judge sin globally again when he comes in the day of the Son of Man. So if you're not in Jesus Christ as your ark of salvation tonight, if you're listening online, then I encourage you, trust Jesus, trust the Bible, trust the history. You can trust the history, you can trust the future, you can trust the theology of the Bible. Jesus Christ is your ark of salvation from the coming wrath to come. So that's the biblical foundation and how Jesus treated biblical chronology and history. So dates, let's talk a bit about dates. All the stuff we found so boring in school history lessons, e.g. when was the Battle of Hastings? 1066. That's an AD date, Anno Domini date, 1066. There was a chronologist, a biblical scholar called Edwin Richard Teale, and he was a missionary in China as well, an archaeologist and writer, scholar of the Old Testament. He famously stated chronology is the backbone of history. So it's a rather obvious but very important statement, and no one will question it. So when we look into the matter, however, we are confronted with the question, what in fact is the chronology and the events in the ancient Near East, Bible times and places? What is the chronology that forms the backbone of our understanding of the events that happened during the millennia before Christ? So BC dating, this is where the rubber meets the road as far as biblical chronology is concerned, because the Bible seems to provide a chronology from creation to the cross, but it's not the same as the chronology of the ancient world that is in use today, both in secular and sadly in evangelical Christian circles. So I went to a Bible college where they taught evolution quite regularly and a history before the history that's outlined in the Bible. So the Bible has a lot to say about Egypt as well. It's mentioned over 585 times in the Bible. But if that's not viewed to line up with Egyptian history, then what does that say about
Gavin,
history in the Bible? Did you say something,
sorry to
Donnie?
interrupt, Gavin.
Yeah.
Brian. Sorry, Gavin. Your slides stopped playing, so I just
Oh,
figured I'd let you know.
can I share
It's
them
not on my
again?
end. Yeah. Let me try removing it and then bring it back.
Do you want me to share them
Okay,
again?
there you go. No, there you go. It's on there now. So it did that same thing to Donnie once. Oh, it just flipped off again.
Yeah,
Did you do
I
something?
stopped sharing. I'll share them again, shall I?
Okay. It did
No
the same
worries.
thing to Donnie on the last time I had an interview with him, and I noticed it did that to you. So I figured I want to chime in
Okay, no
before you get too
worries.
far.
Yeah, yeah, we
Uh,
don't want to miss anything. So let's go back to where I was. Oh, yes, we're
All right,
thinking
is
about
that good?
how to get
All right,
BC
I'll go ahead and take
dates.
mine off now.
All right,
I just wanted to. Yes, I
can you
can
see
see
the
them.
clouds and a beautiful
Yes,
blue sky?
yes.
Good. So we're talking
All right.
about BC dates and AD dates. So just how are BC dates assigned to these Egyptian kingdom periods and their rulers? So that's a statue of Queen Victoria there. So in our modern age, we can research the life of a relatively recent monarch compared to Egyptian history. For example, we might say that the British Queen Victoria lived from AD 1819 to 1901. So when we see the name of an Egyptian pharaoh with a similar regnal date next to it, our natural inclination is to presume that these are accurate and were recorded in the same way that we do today, but they are not. So we need to recognize that. Egyptian rulers dated their reigns in relation to each other or their early ancestors. They didn't date their reigns to the date of creation because such knowledge was lost to them, and they certainly don't date their reigns to BC dates for obvious reasons. They didn't know that Christ was coming or when. So the BC dates have to be worked out by scholars. And that's where the big questions come in. So obviously Egyptian artifacts don't get dug up with BC dates labels attached to them. Those dates have to be worked out by experts and attached later. But those dates involve a lot of uncertainties, presuppositions, and assumptions, all based on materialistic worldviews, and dates which get more difficult to establish the older the artifact is. But the unfortunate thing is, the problem is that secularists maintain a veritable army of state university-sponsored archaeologists, translators of ancient writings, and historians, all maintaining the standard secularist line in the area of ancient Near East chronology. And against this formidable array of scholarship and speculation, the pitiable forces of evangelical, traditionalist, and modernist Christianity long ago capitulated. So for the creationists among us in our audience tonight, this is a major problem. It's a challenge. So the problem arises from the fact that if the Bible is inerrant, then its chronology is inerrant. If the Bible's chronology is inerrant, then a great deal of secularist speculation about the ancient Near East is in error. If this is true, the Bible-believing community is confronted with a massive revisionist project. So the entire history of the ancient Near East will have to be reassessed. This will not be acceptable to secularist scholars who've built their careers and book publishing deals accepted on these chronologies. If you think I'm being a bit harsh tonight, then this was the kind of thing that I came across in my studies in Egyptology, that the Egyptologists recognized that, yes, Egyptian chronology isn't all that it's cracked up to be. So did you know that up until the mid-1700s, when it comes to the date of creation and the flood, the dominant view in Europe regarding Earth history was based on a literal interpretation of Genesis. The Earth is only about 6,000 years old, and Noah's flood was a global catastrophe just around 4,500 years ago. So by the beginning of the 19th century, there developed two main schools of geology. Most leading geologists were catastrophists. So they believed that the Earth's geology was best explained as the result of cataclysms. However, many of these influenced by unbiblical thinking, believed in long ages and multiple catastrophes. Nevertheless, there were also many scriptural geologists, as they come up on the screen here, who held that Noah's flood, as recorded in Genesis, was worldwide and was the greatest catastrophic event ever. And if you're interested in learning more about these, you can go onto answersingenesis.org and type in British scriptural geologists, and that came from Terry Mortensen's PhD thesis. These were genuine scientists. They were empirically minded, very detail orientated. They went to the field, they studied the rocks, they studied the fossils, and they wrote about what they saw, what they observed. And they could see the catastrophe in the rocks. They didn't see millions of years. They didn't see stasis. They didn't see signs of evolution. What they see in the rocks was catastrophic and lined up with the biblical history. But unfortunately, their voices were drowned out by ideas of deep time, billions of years. So deep time is the idea of millions and billions of years of history, long before Darwin actually moves were afoot to undermine biblical authority, particularly by demolishing its timeline of creation to the flood. This was done deliberately by demolishing its timeline. This was done by philosophers, deists we call them, influenced by pantheism and paganism, like James Hutton in the 18th century, who saw rocks as the product of the earth as an eternally perpetuating machine, with a succession of worlds extending indefinitely back into the past. And he wrote about this in his Theory of the Earth in 1788. Charles Lyell, he's best known as the author of Principles of Geology in 3 volumes. He was trained as a lawyer, and he was influenced by long-age thinking and geologist William Buckland. So Lyell's aim was to divest geology of biblical history, i.e. the flood and creation. And he wrote to his friend, geologist and fellow naturalist George Poulet Scrope, who was about to write a review of Lyell's Volume 1 of Principles of Geology for the Quarterly Review. So that was a bit of nepotism for you. And he wrote to his friend and said, "I'm sure you may get into QR, Quarterly Review, what will free the science from Moses." Lyell goes on to say, "I conceived the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic geology could be set down, i.e. contradicted or repudiated, without giving offense," so he's talking to the established church there, "it would be an historical sketch, i.e. deny biblical history, and you must abstract mine, i.e. his anti-biblical history." So that was his method, his idea was to free geology from creation and the flood, get rid of the God of the Bible. And Darwin read the first 2 volumes of Lyell's Principles aboard the Beagle when he was traveling around the world, and based his theory of biological evolution on Lyell's erroneous theory of a long age for the Earth and geological evolution. So here they are, James Hutton. The result, therefore, for our present inquiries that we find no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. So throwing out the history of the Bible that has a beginning. Charles Lyell, free the science from Moses, if ever the Mosaic geology could be set down. And Charles Darwin took all that on board and based his theory of evolution on millions and millions of years. Now, this affected the church, of course, and the supposed evidence and weight of scientific authority for nearly a century. The evangelical world surrendered biblical history and has maintained that there are supposed gaps in the biblical chronology, and that therefore we cannot say the world was created around 4000 BC. So this compromising belief attempts to make possible an accommodation to deep time and ancient human origins and culture. And this was popularized by Schofield, and he had a Schofield reference Bible, and he put in his notes in the early chapters of Genesis this idea of a gap, that you can cram all the millions and billions of years in between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1 verse 2. And hey presto, all your embarrassing problems go away. But do they? They don't, because there can be little question that the reason for evangelical reassessments of biblical chronology was the rise of evolutionary geology and archaeology. In order to protect the Bible from the charge of error in its detailing of the creation, evangelicals frequently turn to this gap theory, or the day-age theory, or the framework hypothesis, and there's a few other novel ideas floating around today. So in order to reconcile Genesis 1 with the assured results of modern scientific inquiry. But unfortunately, this drives a wedge between Genesis and, for instance, Paul's theology, where he clearly says that death came as a result of Adam's sin, that God created everything in the beginning perfect, without death and bloodshed. And if you drive millions and millions of years through the Bible, you're actually adding death and suffering and bloodshed before the fall. And that rips the heart out of the gospel. Why should Jesus Christ come and die to save us from death and suffering, which apparently is part of the natural order that God used to create? Doesn't make sense, does it? No, he rescued us from death so that we can appear before God in a new creation and have a restored relationship with him. So this idea of a secular Stone Age, the idea of a Stone Age lasting for 100,000 years or more, is actually refuted by common sense and population growth statistics. So this is the idea of the Stone Age, goes right back to 2 million BC. There's various levels of the Stone Age: Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, which has 4 parts, and then the Chalcolithic, which is the most recent. So when it comes to population growth, how many people are in the world today, that actually lines up beautifully with the Bible. So if people have been here for this supposed period for hundreds and thousands of years, and there was no global flood of Noah's day, there should be a lot more people than there are now, or there should be a lot more human remains or artifacts. But where are all the bodies? Let's just think about how we can calculate this. So evolutionists claim that mankind evolved from apes about 1 million years ago. And if the population had grown at just a tiny 0.01% per year since then, doubling only every 7,000 years, there could be as much as 10 to the power of 43 people today. That's a number with 43 zeros after it. Certainly not standing room on the planet with that number. So you have to have a ridiculously, unrealistically slow population growth. And if you have a population growth so slow, that would show up in the genetics, and it doesn't. Population genetics shows that human population growth was sudden and quick. It wasn't stagnated like that. So evolutionists claim that a Stone Age of about 100,000 years, some extend it to over 2 million years, where between 1 million and 10 million people lived on Earth. So fossil evidence shows that people buried their dead, often with artifacts. Cremation was not practiced until relatively recent times in evolutionary thinking. And if there were just 1 million people alive during that time, with an average generation time of 25 years, there should have been buried 4 billion bodies and many artifacts. If there were 10 million people, it would mean that 40 billion bodies have been buried in the earth. And if the evolutionary timescale were correct, then we would expect the skeletons of the buried bodies to be largely still present after 100,000 years, because many ordinary bodies, bones rather, had claimed to be much older than that have been found. However, even if the bodies had disintegrated, lots of artifacts should still be found. So where are they all? So the fact of the matter is that human population now is consistent with biblical history, that just 3 couples repopulated the earth 4,500 years ago. When we take a very reasonable 0.46% growth rate per annum, we reach over 8 billion people today. Now that's a secular graph, but you can line that up with the Bible perfectly. And if you start off with 3 couples about 4,500 years ago. Very reasonable 0.46% growth rate. Hey presto, you get over 8 billion people today. So the Bible's history is accurate, it's true. So when it comes to the pyramids of Egypt, just a century or so after Babel, I'd say that there'll be enough people to build them in the biblical timescale, even using the Masoretic text shorter chronology. So because of long-age thinking based on geology and evolution, the chronology of the Bible also proved an embarrassment in that scholars were confident that archaeological remains had been unearthed from civilizations dating from before the Bible's date for the flood and creation of 4000 BC. So evangelicals were forced either to reconcile the Bible to evolutionary thinking-based archaeology or reject the establishment and scholarly respectability and hold to the biblical scheme for geology and archaeology, but lose academic credibility and respectability. So in other words, they want praise of men rather than God and not be counted as fools for Christ. So you and me, Brian, tonight, we're ready to be counted as fools for Christ, but not lose our brains. Actually, to hold the biblical chronology, you need to think. You need to work all of this out very carefully. By the way, we've got some pictures of pottery here on the screen, and that's the most common way to date archaeological sites. And the styles of pottery and the patterns change through the centuries. Their materials can be dated using carbon-14, but even this is quite subjective and prone to error. So we've got a lot of thinking to do. And as we've seen, a few creationist scholars maintain the traditional Christian view of geology, but until very recently, there's been very little movement in the realm of biblical archaeology and maintaining a biblical chronology. So for the most part, the chronological data of Genesis 5 and 11 have been put aside by archaeologists. For instance, this professor of Old Testament, Wesley Theological Seminary, Washington, Dewey Morris Beagle, he was very honest in his book, said this highlighting the embarrassing aspect for him of biblical chronology. He said this: until geological information disproved the 4004 date, most Jews and Christians, including many alert, even brilliant persons, thought the genealogy in Genesis 5 was intended to show the consecutive history of man. Inasmuch as some evangelicals in the 19th century felt the force of the new geological information, they were inclined to stretch the genealogy enough to provide gaps for the scientific data. But how did this relate to the intent of the author? That's very important to ask. Goes on to say, if the geological and other scientific data known today had not been made available to us, would we have doubted that Genesis 5 was intended to be chronological? Not likely. The biblical evidence is too explicit at this point. It is our scientific knowledge that causes us to ignore the clear meaning of the passage. Obviously, then, the intent of the biblical writer can hardly be accommodated to the scientific facts made available from generation to generation. So is Beagle correct in what he implies? Have evangelical scholars simply drummed up artificial and futile arguments against biblical chronology in order to retain academic respectability? Or are there, in fact, aspects of the problem that did not come to light until recent years, aspects of which earlier expositors were unaware? Now, of course, if in fact the Bible shows that the chronogenealogies, they're not just chronologies, they're chronogenealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 have gaps, and therefore cannot be taken rigorously, then that's another matter. But they don't. So I don't say that they have gaps. And so we must not let ourselves be browbeaten or bullied by these scholars and biblical professors be forced by their ridicule to adopt an unsound position. And Noah's supposed extra Canaan doesn't prove that there are gaps. Actually, if you've heard about this extra Canaan argument, there are actually early copies of the Septuagint that do not have the extra Canaan in Genesis 11, but later copies post-dating Luke's Gospel do have the extra Canaan. So that's a bit of an in the weeds argument there. That's always used to try and argue that there are gaps in the chronology, but there aren't. You can't argue that way. So when it comes to the actual meaning of the biblical author, David Watson asked world-class Hebrew scholar Professor James Barr such questions about biblical chronology. What did the author mean? Did he mean that the world was really created in 6 days? Did he really mean that there was a global flood? Did he really mean that the chronogenealogies could be used to actually form a chronology of the Bible? And he replied, and he said this, very plain. Probably so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 to 11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. The figures contained in the Genesis genealogies provided by simple addition a chronology from the beginning of the world up to later stages in the biblical story. Noah's flood was understood to be worldwide and extinguish all human and animal life except for those in the ark. Or to put it negatively, the apologetic arguments which suppose the days of creation to be long eras of time, the figures of years not to be chronological, and the flood to be a merely local Mesopotamian flood are not taken seriously by any such professors as far as I know. Now, he's not saying that he believes that or that any of these professors in these universities believe that, but he's saying that the biblical text, the Hebrew, demands that you respect the biblical author who believed these things. James Barr, consistent with his neo-Orthodox views, does not believe in Genesis, but he understood what the Hebrew so clearly taught. It was only the perceived need to harmonize with the alleged age of the earth that led people to think anything different. It was nothing to do with the biblical text itself. So stop trying to force millions of years into the Bible. You can't do it. So in conclusion, there's no way to evade the challenge of biblical chronology. If we try to pretend that Genesis 5 and 11 and other Old Testament data contained, for instance, in the book of Chronicles, do not provide a chronology, we should be regarded as foolish by intelligent unbelievers who can plainly see that there is a biblical chronology. So if we accept the biblical chronology and enter into the task of rethinking the secularist chronology of the ancient Near East, we should be regarded as foolish by the secularists. Either way, we should be regarded as foolish. This being the case, let us not worry about what others may think and ask the question, what does God think? What does his word actually say? At least then we can be honest. But others have tried another avenue, abandoning biblical chronology for Egyptian chronology. Does this work? Is this the solution? So Egypt has so many monuments, artifacts and texts that tie to kings and queens and their regnal dates. Surely this must be a reliable source of history. I mean, it lasted 3 millennia, we're told by the secularists. So Egyptian chronology has been tied to other ancient cultures throughout the ancient Near East as an anchor. But this has caused problems with other ancient Near East chronologies. And this is something that particularly Robert Morcott and his team, when I was at Exeter University, wrote in their very famous book, Centuries of Darkness. And they recognized that an overextended Egyptian chronology has massive problems for other ancient Near East chronologies when you try and tie it all up to Egyptian chronology. So where does the problem start? So did you know that the secular Egyptian chronology is a speculative composite of various pieces of data, loosely hinged on a chronology of Egypt compiled by an Egyptian priest called Manetho? And he flourished around 300 BC. And everyone admits, however, that Manetho's chronology is in error at numerous points. And we'll see a few examples of this. The result is that the secularist chronology of the ancient Near East actually has very little foundation. Did you know that Manetho also wrote a history far removed from the events he compiled? So the time from Manetho to the time man landed on the moon is not as great as the first Egyptian dynasty to Manetho. So that is all that incredible stretch of history that he wasn't there to observe. He wasn't there to see it. He's just relying on history that's been handed down and down and down. So secularists consider biblical chronology as an unacceptable alternative to this chronology because it's far too short. So if there was a global flood around 2350 BC, as the Bible maintains, then Egyptian civilization could not have arisen around 4000 BC or even 3000 BC as is maintained. So Egypt would have arisen shortly before 2000 BC, i.e. after the flood and after Babel. And that really compresses Egyptian chronology. So in other words, the Egyptian pyramids couldn't have been built before the flood. There must be post-flood constructions. If you look at, I've been to the pyramids many times, and I've actually collected fossils that have weathered out of the pyramid blocks. So there are fossils in the blocks. So they're made out of flood sediments. So there's no time for pre-dynastic and Stone Age slow and gradual developments within biblical history. All of this would have happened as Ham's tribe would have settled into the Nile Valley after Babel, and within a couple of centuries, population statistics show that they would have been able to populate enough people to actually build the pyramids. So though the secularist chronology shifts from time to time, and indeed it actually has become shorter in the 20th century, it never becomes anywhere near short enough to accommodate the chronology of the Bible, even accepting the longer Septuagint chronology. So there's little doubt that Manetho was trying to prove to the Greeks that the Egyptians were the world's oldest civilization. This was a hot issue amongst the different cultures of the day. So Berosus, he was a Hellenistic era Babylonian writer, was attempting to claim the same thing about the Mesopotamians, as was a chap called Eratosthenes. He was a Greek. He was also the chief librarian at the Great Library of Alexandria. And interestingly, he was the first person to calculate the circumference of the earth. And in Manetho's work, Egyptia, or the History of Egypt, Manetho compiled Egyptian history into the 30 dynasties that are commonly used today. So as part of his agenda to extend Egyptian civilization as far back as he could, Manetho also included the names of many of the pre-dynastic kings called gods and spirits of the dead in the Turin Papyrus, which no scholar today would say was historical. So, and I would actually say that they represent paganized memories of the pre-flood and post-flood patriarchs who lived to tremendous ages. So even though Manetho's chronologies are the most widely used, no original copies of his writings exist today, and the early surviving references to his works are in Josephus. He wrote in against Appian. So there was a big race on at the time to prove who was the most important culture, and whoever had the oldest culture won. So that's what's going on, I think. This is Josephus Justus Scaliger, and he was the first to bring Manetho to Western academia. He was a French Calvinist. He was a religious leader and a scholar, known for expanding the notion of classical history from the Greeks and Romans to include Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, and ancient Egyptian history. So he was quite the bookworm. So he was able to study all of this and compile it all together and put it all together. But his chronological material came into conflict with the Bible, because he was treating all these pagan sources uncritically and treating the biblical chronology critically. So Scaliger, he's the first chap to start the modern science of chronology. So the authority of Scaliger's studies was generally recognized. In his second major work, the Thesaurus Temporum, which he published in 1606, he collected, restored, and arranged every chronological relic extant in Greek and Latin, as well as Byzantine summary of the writings of Manetho. However, the chronology he constructed became impossible to reconcile with the biblical view of world history, because he failed to begin with the Bible as inerrant history. So if you don't do that, you get into all sorts of problems. So Scaliger was the first to construct the artificial Julian timescale from astronomical and calendrical elements. He provided a neutral dimension of time, as it were, on which rival chronologies could be set out and compared. So computing the information given by Manetho for the lengths of the 30 Egyptian dynasties which Manetho proposed, Scaliger set the start of the first dynasty in 5285 BC, and that lay a considerable 1,336 years before his own date for the creation, which he calculated from the Masoretic as 3,949 BC. So Manetho's list was an invaluable primary source, but it led Scaliger into direct conflict with Scripture. So Scaliger attempted a compromise, but instead of recognizing the fallibility of his pagan sources, he changed the meaning of Scripture's account of history to include a period of what he called proleptic time. So in his thinking, it was anticipatory time before the creation. So it's a bit of an absurd contrivance, supposedly explaining how historical dynasties could have begun far earlier than the Bible seemed to allow. He was actually the first gap theorist. So Scaliger's discovery of Manetho was widely acclaimed by many scholars, and those who accepted the Bible's account of history tried to shorten Manetho's history by assuming many of the dynasties reigned concurrently in different parts of Egypt, which, as we shall see, is a perfectly reasonable assumption. And I think that is actually true, that you can't string all these pharaohs out. You don't have the evidence. There was probably more evidence to suggest that there were pharaohs reigning in the north and the south, possibly even in the middle. And that if you do that, you actually concertina Egyptian time. But the unintended result of Scaliger's work was that the later scholars concluded that Adam could not have been the first man. So Scaliger's problem was that he treated Manetho uncritically and with greater respect than Scripture. And evidence shows you cannot do that. And the Bible shows you cannot do that. So I'm sure you've all heard of James Ussher, and he was an Archbishop of Armagh. He's the next chronologist after Scaliger. He was a noted historian and Hebrew scholar, highly regarded throughout Britain, both by kings and revolutionaries. And in 1650 and 1654, he published his magnus opus, The Annals of the World, a 1,300-page tome in Latin on a history of the world covering every major event from the time of creation up to AD 70. In this, he calculated the date of creation at 23rd of October 4004 BC, based upon the received Masoretic text. And this is what he's best known for today, and probably what he's mocked for, actually. So we would suggest that creation is around 4000 BC. And Ussher adopted the sophisticated dating system that had been devised by Scaliger, but at many points criticized Scaliger in his Annals. So we are very much aware of the chronogenealogies of Genesis. And Genesis as a book covers some 2,286 years from the beginning of creation to the death of Joseph in the end of Genesis there. But this is chronological information that we're given in Genesis. And if we take the Bible seriously, then we need to take the chronology seriously. And if we take the chronology seriously, we can formulate a history that is accurate and that lines up with what we see in the archaeological record. And of course, it talks about the Exodus after Genesis, Moses and Israel in Egypt. Is there evidence from Moses and Israel in Egypt? And we're going to look at that a little bit later. So Ussher's creation date has become a bit of a figure of fun. However, it is well kept secret that some great scientists also calculated creation dates very closely to Ussher. For example, Johann Kepler, here who formulated the laws of planetary motion, which are still used today in rocket science, calculated a date of 3992 BC for creation. And also Isaac Newton is widely regarded as the greatest scientist of all time. He wrote more on biblical history, did you know, than science, and vigorously defended a creation date of about 4000 BC. So don't laugh at creationists. Some of the greatest scientists in the world, they came to similar dates. So Ussher's methods were entirely keeping with the norms of 17th century scholarship and actually represented a monumental work of research. He was no fool. The two dates of 4004 BC for the creation and 2348 BC for the flood provided by Ussher gave immovable points for any chronology. So no archaeological monuments could possibly have survived the flood, including the pyramids. The extinct creatures known from fossils could be explained only by interpreting them as evidence for the flood, which we at Answers in Genesis write and research on continuously. So Ussher in his Annals made use of Josephus, Eusebius, and other ancient historians, but he rejected Manetho as unreliable up to the New Kingdom's 18th dynasty that began with Ahmose, which most of Egyptian history prior to that, which means he rejected most of Egyptian history prior to that. And you can actually obtain a copy of Annals of the World for yourself from Master Books, and we sell that through Answers in Genesis. So he rejected Manetho in many places. So when we look at Manetho's dates, they park the pyramids right in the period of the flood, and has the beginning of the first dynasty just as Adam died. So of course modern secular archaeology has pre-dynastic Egyptian history extending tens of thousands of years before the biblical creation date into the so-called Stone Age. So from what information does modern Egyptology use to construct a chronology? King lists. And there are a number of different king lists available to scholars. There's the Karnak king list, which I'm showing here, the Turin papyrus, the Abydos king list, the Saqqara tablet, the Palermo stone. However, these are lists of names, as we see coming in on the screen here, often contradictory and don't have dates attached. So in many places, it's difficult, if impossible, to establish ruler relationships. Were some kings concurrent, or did they rule consecutively? Although Manetho used these, he spelled the pharaohs' names in Greek, and many of these names bear no relation to the Egyptian names. So the most complete example is the king list of Abydos, found in the 19th dynasty. It contains a list of 76 kings, allegedly in order from the Old Kingdom to Seti I in the New Kingdom, which is the 19th dynasty. And it's the only source we have regarding the names of some pharaohs that allegedly existed, which makes it contradictory with other lists on that point alone. So secular scholars readily admit that this list is inaccurate and contains many errors. For example, the second intermediate period, which includes the time of the Hyksos. However, the Turin king list does contain many names from the second intermediate period, though fragmented, including Theban rulers and Hyksos kings, confirming their existence. So there are missing kings on the lists, for instance, those considered non-Egyptian or Hyksos, or heretics like Akhenaten, or kings considered illegitimate by the very ones drawing up the lists. So if certain pharaohs didn't like other pharaohs, they were off the list. So the question then is, which parts of Egyptian history is more reliable than others? So the best attested is the most recent, because the archaeology has survived and can be used to construct a more reliable late chronology. But even here, the latest dig find can change orders of events and dates, so everything is up for grabs. And as I said earlier, the further you go back in history, the less archaeology there is, the more assumptions you make, the less of a reliable chronology you have. So let's talk about synchronisms. Synchronism is happens when an event in Egypt meshes up with another event in another culture. It could be a time of war. It could be correspondence, where one ruler talks to another ruler by correspondence. So we have a synchronism. This ruler lived at the same time as this ruler. So we can have a link, like, if you like, a rung on a ladder. And these are Amarna letters before us here. They're cuneiform tablets, and they were correspondence between vassal states in Canaan, in the Levant. So these are well documented, and in this area that most disputes over reigns and dates are usually in the range of decades between the Levant kings and Egypt. So compared to the Old and Middle Kingdoms, which have fewer records and synchronisms, meaning that these could be as many as hundreds of years off. So the Valley of the King tombs were cut into the hills on the west side of the Nile River. I've been there and had a look in some of these tombs. And opposite the city of ancient Thebes, now Luxor, they contain a wealth of information about New Kingdom kings. So we can use that to establish a chronology. Another source of chronological information I've already mentioned is the Turin King List, or the Turin Royal Canon, and that comprises pieces of papyrus written in hieratic script. So that's not your regular Egyptian hieroglyphs carved in stone. It was written on papyrus. They're from the reign of Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, 19th dynasty, son of Seti I. It's displayed in the Egyptian Museum in Turin in Italy, and I've been there. So Ramesses II also added his own list at Abydos. So if the Turin list was compiled at his request, it may well have been a continued attempt to legitimize both his and his father's right to the throne. So much of the beginning and ending are lost, but what can be seen reveals reigns in years, months, and even days for some kings. They also compiled into family groups, the same groups that seem to form the basis of the dynasties compiled by the later Egyptian historian Manetho. And the Turin Canon also contains these mysterious spirits of the dead and demigods, which reigned for thousands and hundreds of years, which Manetho treated as historical and included in his king list, so greatly extending Egyptian history. Strangely, this list, here are all the different parts that scholars have studied. Strangely, this list was written on the back of a tax roll. Given that it was a previously used papyrus, it seems to signify a distinct lack of importance if commissioned by a king. Another question about its historical reliability is that it contains these mystical pro-dynastic king gods, demigods, spirits, and human beings who ruled Egypt for hundreds of years, each from creation up to the time of the document was presumably crafted. So here's another source of information that we can use to build a chronology. This is the Palermo stone. It's viewed as a vital insight into the Old Kingdom, but remains controversial. So many Egyptologists are unsure as to whether it was constructed at the end of the period it describes, or whether it was assembled as late as the 25th dynasty, or even added to over time. There are also doubts as to whether it is an original or even a copy of a copy. So this brings into question whether there may have been copying mistakes and potential modifications, either accidental or deliberate, of the text based upon any possible agendas of the ruling pharaohs when any possible copies were made. So you can't treat any of these sources uncritically. You have to treat them carefully and weigh all the evidence. And that means you have to have a worldview to do that. So the New Kingdom also has a time of unprecedented expansion of Egyptian rule into neighboring countries. As such, archaeologists have found many synchronisms via writings, letters, and artifacts in these countries that were contemporaneous to what became commonly known as the Egyptian Empire. So the New Kingdom is pretty good when it comes to archaeology and forming a chronology. So there are parts of Egyptian history that I would say, yeah, there's no problem. But the further you go back, the more shaky the whole edifice becomes. So does all this sound a bit confusing? When attempting to construct a proper backward order of those kings from a specific known time to develop a timeline, one has to presume that the king lists we have are accurate, and it is known that they are not. Even secular archaeologists admit it's all a bit of a mess. So, for instance, Egyptologist Sir Alan Gardner, who was a giant of his time, wrote that even when full use has been made of the king lists and of such subsidiary sources as have survived, the indispensable dynastic framework of Egyptian history shows lamentable gaps and many a doubtful attribution. What is proudly advertised as Egyptian history is merely a collection of rags and tatters. Wow, you don't hear that on the TV, do you? You don't hear that in our school textbooks. It's a bit of a trade secret amongst Egyptologists. Another brilliant scholar was Kenneth Kitchen, who only died last year. He was a British biblical scholar, ancient Near East historian, and professor emeritus of Egyptology at University Liverpool. He was considered an eminent scholar. He was also an evangelical Christian with a high view of scripture. And he states in his monumental work, The Third Intermediate Period, considered the world's leading expert on this period. He said this, in recent years, the data Manetho have received more attention than hitherto in an endeavor to extract from them whatever may contain of chronological value and to combine them with the first-hand data of the monuments as an aid towards establishing a firm Egyptian chronology. However, in making any such attempt, it has always to be borne in mind that however good Manetho's sources and consequent compilation may originally have been, we now possess only very late copies of copies, which have been subject to centuries not only of straight copying, but also at certain periods of tendentious manipulation. And what we have, even in this form, is not Manetho's history, but merely an epitome, as a summary or an extract of his dynasties and reigns, a few citations, e.g. in Josephus, and largely spurious reminiscences that may ultimately derive in part from his data, e.g. the Book of Sothis. So thus it is in vain to expect total confirmation from the monuments from all our extant Manetho, nor should we manipulate the evidence of the monuments merely to fit the extant text of the epitome of Manetho. However, it is also true that the corruptions in our extant Manetho are very uneven in their distribution. In some parts, most of the data transmitted corresponds strikingly well with the first-hand monumental evidences. For instance, on the 21st dynasty, i.e. the later stuff, the period that's closer to Manetho, while in other parts, even close by, the Menophonic data are confused and corrupted, almost beyond the point of repair in their present state. For instance, chaotic overlaps of the late 18th and 19th dynasties, and at our present level of knowledge. So I make the joke that kitchen throws the sink at Manetho. So we also have a problem in biblical studies at Exodus, and this is very fundamental for us as Christians about how we understand when the Exodus happened. So we've seen that the secular Egyptologists, their trade secret is, Egyptian history is not all it's cracked up to be. You can't rely on it. Every dig, every find can change the story. But when it comes to the Bible, we have to tread carefully because of the Ramesses problem, and I'll outline that for you. And this means how we look at the archaeology of Israel in Egypt. And that actually hinges on how we interpret what this Ramesses is referring to. So at first glance, Exodus 1:11 appears to state the Israelites built a city called Ramesses or Ramses and departed from Ramesses in Exodus 12:37. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramses. And in Exodus 12, they set out from Ramesses in the first month on the 15th day of the month. On the day after the Passover, the people of Israel went out triumphantly in the sight of all the Egyptians. So these are all assumed to be alternative spellings of the pharaoh modern Egyptologists refer to as Ramesses, and particularly Ramesses II, the Great, who was the biggest builder and built a city called Pi-Ramesses. So this is the view made popular in the movies. The Exodus happened during Ramesses II, the biggest and grandest builder of them all. If Ramesses II is being referred to, then this has huge chronological implications. The first being the Exodus needs to be placed at a later date than Scripture allows, which is 1446 BC. We'll talk about that a bit later. And as importantly, Egyptologists are being truthful when they say there's zero evidence of Israel being in Egypt during Ramesses II's reign. And this is where the biblical chronology falls apart in scholarship, because they say, the Bible's saying that Ramesses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. We go do our digs. In that time, we find no evidence of Israel in Egypt. Therefore, the whole chronology of the Bible falls apart then. They've ditched the chronology of creation and the flood, and now Israel and Egypt is thrown out too. And in one sense, they are being honest, because when you look at Ramesses II period in Egypt, there is no evidence for Israel. And we're fed this all the time. Ramesses II, he was the great pharaoh of the Exodus. And we hear that and see that in the movies all the time. But I would say no, Ramesses II is not the pharaoh of the Exodus. And many theologians have suggested the name Ramesses is actually a gloss. And I don't mean a coat of shiny paint. It's a scribal explanation inserted later, a replacement name to explain to a later audience where Israel settled and left at the time of the Exodus. Now that sounds a bit liberal, doesn't it? But hang on with me just a minute and I'll explain. So what seems to prove this beyond doubt is the name Ramesses appears much earlier in Joseph's time. Here we are in Genesis 47:11. And Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Genesis 47:11. No scholar would ever suggest that Joseph and his family arrived in the time of Ramesses II. So why say the Exodus happened during his time? It's not consistent, is it? So let's look at this gloss, this idea that this was an inserted name for a later audience. The gloss could well have been supplied by whoever? Joshua. And I think this is a very good theory. So if Moses composed the Pentateuch around 1334 BC, which is a good biblical date based on the Masoretic text, then this was just 40 years before Ramesses I took the throne. This places it in the time of Joshua, who is believed to have edited the Torah, e.g. possibly recording Moses' death. So obviously Moses couldn't write about his own death, could he, in Deuteronomy chapter 34. Joshua studied the Torah, Joshua 1:8, and wrote words into the Torah. For instance, Joshua 24:26. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God and took a great stone and set it up there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. So during his time, he could well have supplied the gloss and said, during Ramesses I, this is our time right now, this is when Israel was in Egypt. And for me, that makes perfect sense. So that lays aside all of the chronological issues. It's an assumption that it's Ramesses II, but Ramesses I would have been in Joshua's time frame. And I think that's a perfectly allowable theory to hold. So let's look at where Goshen was actually in Egypt, and what the archaeology has actually revealed, and it's pretty mind-blowing. So this is archaeologist Manfred Beitek at this place called Avaris. So the site of ancient Avaris in northern Egypt, where renowned Austrian archaeologist Manfred Beitek has been digging in Egypt for over 25 years. So Avaris sits directly south and even partly underneath the later city that Ramesses II established. And Beitek says this city was occupied by what the Egyptians would call Asiatics. They're Semitic peoples. That sounds very interesting, doesn't it? So in addition, they've uncovered 12 tombs of leaders of 12 tribes, including a statue of an important Semitic leader wearing a multicolored coat that was deliberately desecrated. So this is a diagram of this particular Semitic leader that they found in Avaris. And this is the face that was desecrated. And we can recognize that that's not an Egyptian hairstyle there. This is a computer generation of what they found, tombs, 12 tombs, and a pyramid tomb for the most important one. And inside there is this statue with a multicolored coat. How interesting. Who wore a multicolored coat, I wonder? So there's a lot of other evidence that circumstantially seems to fit very well with the biblical account where the Pharaoh of the day allowed the Hebrews to freely settle in Egypt. The only time in Egyptian history that could have happened was when the Hyksos ruled in Egypt. They were Semitic peoples, Semitic pharaohs. They were cousins of the Israelites, and they would have been quite happy for fellow cousins to settle in the land of Egypt. And it's only during this period that Israel under Joseph could have prospered. And after the Hyksos were thrown out again by the native Egyptians, that's when the Pharaoh came to power that did not know Joseph. And that's when the Israelites were enslaved and cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up Moses. So when you look at it at that period of time, the 18th dynasty, everything starts to slot into place beautifully. You might have heard of David Roll. He's popularized these discoveries in Avaris and tried to force them into his chronological scheme as a rescuing device for biblical chronology. He raised a huge straw man fallacy when he states that archaeological excavations in Egypt and the Levant ongoing for the best part of the last 2 centuries have produced no tangible evidence to demonstrate the historical veracity of the early biblical narratives. Direct material support for the traditional history of the Israelite nation is handed down in the books of Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles is virtually non-existent. And actually, Associates of Biblical Research, State of Roll's New Chronology, that this statement is, of course, grossly exaggerated and inaccurate, as even a cursory review of the many books on archaeology in the Bible will reveal. By making such a statement, Roll has set up a straw man which he can now proceed to knock down by means of his new chronology. In actual fact, however, the cure is worse than the sickness, as the new chronology produces no correlations whatsoever. So we do need to form a new chronology, and Egyptologists recognize that, but some of these new chronological schemes actually pose more problems than others. And unfortunately, David Roll has muddied the water for many Christians. But we need to turn to the Bible itself to form a reliable chronology. So most evangelical scholars generally believe the date for the commencement of the building of the temple, the 4th year of Solomon's reign, is in May 967 or 966 BC. This would place the Exodus at around 1446 or 1445 BC. So to prefer a late Exodus date of 1267 BC, tying it to Ramesses II, the 480th year referred to in Scripture would have to be allegorized. So we can read in 1 Kings 6:1 here, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the 4th month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So you can form a chronological backbone right there, and you can start to hang your historical dates onto that. This is another example of a synchronism. So this historical chronicle describes Nebuchadnezzar's first campaign against Jerusalem in 597 BC. The tablet covers the period of 12 years from the 21st year of Nabopolassar, which is 605 BC, which was also Nebuchadnezzar's accession year, through to the 11th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So this represents a major synchronism or anchor point from which chronologists can begin to work backwards, attaching biblical dates. And actually the Bible talks about 5 named pharaohs, Shoshenq I, which is Shishak. Actually, David Roll tries to break that synchronism, but I've done a lot of work on the Shishak-Shoshenq synchronism to show that it is reliable. And then Osokon the fourth, mentioned as So in 2 Kings 17:4, Taharka, mentioned as Tiharka in 2 Kings 19:9, and Isaiah. Necho II in 2 Kings 23:29, Jeremiah 46:2, and Apries or Hophra, called Hophra in Jeremiah 44:30. So you can start to build a reliable chronology and go backwards in time from what the Bible gives us. And there's enough history there to form a good, solid chronology.
Hey,
So
Gavin,
yeah,
real quick. Could you be able to full screen? I think I actually knocked your presentation off by accident, but I'll bring that back up. But could you put it full screen so people can see that list a little bit better? It's not where it's fully immersed in the screen. You know what I'm saying? Let me see if I can try to bring your presentation back.
oh, you've lost
Okay.
me again.
But do you see me? See it? It's like small screen. Can you do it full screen?
I've not changed anything. So do you want me to stop
No, where I'm
sharing?
at. No. What I'm saying is that could you be able to get it full screen so it's where people can see the words very well?
Have I not been on full screen all night?
Yeah, it's just like it's much smaller, where people might not be able to see it very well.
So can you see the pyramid there?
Yes.
Is that good
That that
size?
that's all. Yes, it is. Thank you. I appreciate
Okay.
it. I just wanted to make sure people can see the words very well.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll carry on, shall I? So the dates for the pyramids construction are based on carbon-14 dating, but the method and particularly the assumptions behind the method, which when properly understood is really the creationist's best friend. So these methods, the methodology rather, the thinking behind it should be questioned. So the dates for the pyramids were obtained from carbon-14 found in wood, reed and straw left by the pyramid builders. So in 1984, dates were obtained for the pyramids radiocarbon project for the Giza pyramids that made the pyramids 374 years older than they expected. Between 1994 and 95, a second analysis reported significant discrepancies from the earlier 1984 study. So the theoretical date range varied greatly for samples containing organic material associated with Khufu's Great Pyramid. These dates were based on the carbon-14 dating method, which obtained wider than a predicted range of dates for the various materials tested, namely 400 years. This result was described as history unfriendly in an online report due to the lack of precision in the calculated results. However, even older First Dynasty tombs at Saqqara were dated at 2920 to 2770 BC, which the project report states is in agreement with other studies. So this problem of old carbon, these dates are obviously much older than the Bible's date for the flood based on the Masoretic text. So since the pyramids must be post-Babel constructions, these dates should be questioned. And the 1994-95 study admitted problems with Old Kingdom dating. It stated that the builders used old wood and recycled material from previous generations, thus contaminating the project's carbon analysis results, giving a false older age. But even older dates have been given for Stone Age relics like this. This is a Napta Playa. It's an archaeological site, one of the earliest of the Nubian Neolithic period, and it's dated to around 7,500 BC using carbon-14 dating. But of course, if you don't recognize that the Earth's magnetic field is decaying much quicker than is generally recognized, according to observation, then your dating will be incorrect. And if you don't take into account the flood with all of that carbon-14 turnover, then your dates will be increasingly wrong the further you go back. So we can't uncritically use carbon-14 dating for very old samples. They become increasingly unreliable. I would say carbon-14 is reliable for younger samples, up to 1,000 years, possibly even older. But in certain areas of biblical history, particularly in David and Solomon's time, there are some real serious problems with carbon dating, which are recognized by secular sources. So let's draw this talk to a conclusion, shall we? So acceptance of geological time meant an abandonment of biblical chronology from creation through to the flood. And acceptance of Manetho's basic chronology uncritically in favor of biblical history meant vast waves of biblical history was thrown out. But Manetho is criticized amongst Egyptologists. So why is Manetho taken so uncritically by biblical studies? There's no evidence of Exodus in Ramesses II time. So when archaeologists look at that time period, they're being honest with it when they say, no, there's no evidence for Israel in Exodus at that time. But if you go back further, then there is evidence of the Semitic peoples in exactly the right place, the northwest Nile Delta, Goshen or Avaris. And they've been digging there for many years and have found lots of evidence of Semitic peoples in Egypt. So the evidence of the Exodus should be placed earlier in the mid-18th dynasty, and many biblical synchronies occur within or modified standard chronology. So when you concertina Egyptian history, then all of those synchronisms with other ancient Near East periods actually line up. So it's not just biblical history that's involved, it's other ancient Near East histories as well. So when you get your Egyptian history, it's not just biblical history that line up, but other ancient Near East histories line up as well. So the first Egyptian dynasties, pyramids fit after the flood and Babel. So these are the main points we have to keep in mind from tonight's talk. And Jesus said in John 3:12, if I've told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? So if Jesus is in error about Moses, earth history and chronology, we can't trust him when it comes to Earth's future or the central gospel theology and morality based upon that history. And if Jesus is in error, the Heavenly Father allowed error to be the basis for central New Testament teaching. Sorry, folks, this is blasphemy. So biblical chronology is really important. Let's not give up on the history in the Bible because our future depends upon it. Let's do the hard thing. Let's do the digging. Let's do the comparison of the archaeology, and let's keep our biblical chronology as the central focus. So if you've enjoyed tonight's talk, I can recommend some resources to you. Evidence of the Bible, archaeological evidence to support the biblical text. There's so much evidence for the Bible that's in the museums. Can't possibly have time enough to talk about it tonight. There's another good evidence for the Bible by Clive Anderson, Brian Edwards. Background to the Bible, archaeological evidence to support the biblical texts. It's a great new book from ICR, Archaeology in the Bible, archaeological evidence to support the biblical texts. So much being brought out of the ground recently that highlights even individual names in the Old Testament. These are great DVD resources as well that you can get from Tim Mahoney, Patterns of Evidence, and they look into all of the evidence for Israel in Egypt. And he goes into much greater detail than I have done tonight. You can also sign up to his Thinker updates. If you go onto Patterns of Evidence, and there's some great resources and online articles that can be sent to you through there. So Q&A time, and I'll stop sharing and back to you, Brian. So I hope you've enjoyed tonight, and if you have any questions, let's go for it.
Right. That was awesome. That presentation makes me want to go back and watch The Mummy. You ever, you ever seen the movie The Mummy with Brendan Fraser?
Is that the one with Tom Cruise?
No, Brandon. No, that's the new one. But Brandon
Okay.
Fraser played in the original, or the
All right.
actually, I think it was one older than that.
Is
But
that
he
the one
played
with Tom?
he played in the one that everybody knows about.
Okay. There's the other one with Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, with some absolutely terrible CGI. He's playing the Scorpion King. Don't know if you've seen that one
Uh,
as well.
yeah, that was in the that was I think that might have been the first one. Or was
Uh-huh.
it the second one? Second one. I think it was second one, maybe.
Yeah, if it's a movie about ancient Egypt, you just can't take it seriously. It's never right.
Yeah. I was wondering if you looked into that and see it's like that's historically wrong.
Yeah, I just roll my eyes. Just eat your popcorn, turn your brain off. It's just entertainment.
Right, right. Uh, it's still fun to watch.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was awesome. I appreciate it very much. I do have lots of questions to go through. I haven't got any in the chat yet. Um, Sorry about letting you know that that wasn't full screen. I should have caught that earlier on, but I just realized that when the words weren't big enough for people to see, and I was like, okay, you might want to try to full screen that so everybody can see it. All right. First question I have is, what is the single biggest assumption in conventional Egyptian chronology that you believe conflicts with the biblical timeline? What is maybe what assumption that is going into uh, um, uh, that understanding of Egyptian chronology, which conflicts with the biblical timeline, as far as that goes?
Yeah, I mean, uncritical treatment of Manetho, uncritical treatment of radiocarbon dating, and not recognizing that at certain periods of an Egyptian history, there were concurrent reigns of pharaohs. So if you treat them consecutively, then you stretch out the timeline of Egypt. So in the times of the intermediate periods, it's known, it's recognized that there were pharaohs reigning in the north and the south, and probably in the foundation of history as well in the Old Kingdom, pre-dynastic periods as well. There would have been tribal chiefs we would call them pharaohs, reigning north, south, in the middle. And if you stretch them out consecutively, then Egyptian history's stretched enormously. So we have to recognize that. And when you do, it all concertinas back together. And when people treat carbon dating uncritically, then that again gives conflicting dates with biblical history. But it's a known fact that carbon dating does not take into account the decay of the magnetic field of the Earth. And if you know about anything about how carbon dating works, so we have the magnetic field around the Earth, and that is protecting the Earth from cosmic rays. So when cosmic rays, neutrinos, hit the Earth's magnetic field, they will interfere with carbon 12 in the atmosphere and bump it up into carbon 14. So it's like every trillion atoms of carbon-12 becomes a carbon-14, and that fills up the atmosphere, and it gets absorbed by plants, and then animals eat the plants, and so they start to store up carbon-14 in their bodies. So when they die, they stop absorbing carbon-14, and the carbon-14 decays back to nitrogen-14. And what you get left is a ratio between carbon-14 and carbon-12, which starts to change. So the carbon-14 gets less and less, and the ratio of carbon-12 to 14 increases. So that's all very well and good, but if your magnetic field is decreasing at the rate that it is today, then there's a lot more neutrinos getting in, producing more carbon-14. So your ratio is altered. So the further you go back, actually, the ratio appears falsely older than it really is, because you've not taken into account the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. And if there was a flood, which of course I say there would have been a massive turnover of carbon-12 into the biosphere. So that would have been dramatically changed the carbon-12-14 ratio. So if you don't take all these changes into account, then your error could be massive. And actually it's known that if you have wood growing near a volcano, and that volcano goes off, it could be hundreds of miles away, and you get all of this ash blown in, absorbed by the wood. All of this ash is basically radiocarbon dead, so it's just pure carbon-14. Massive influx into the biosphere there. You sample the wood, many years later, you get an artificial spike of carbon-12. So that makes the ratio look older. So how would you know that happened? You can't know. And in fact, even some plants absorb carbon-14 differently to other plants. So they could actually have a preferential absorption. So there's so many assumptions that you have to make to do carbon dating, and any assumption could be proved wrong. So you have to really just buy into the hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands of years before history. And if you take those very old dates uncritically, as Christians, we can be damaged in our faith. So I'd say start with the Bible as your firm foundation for understanding history and chronology. And if you look out from there, then God's world will make sense when it comes to God's word. And we don't take man's opinions uncritically compared to God's word.
Right. And that leads me to my next question. From a methodological standpoint, should the Bible be treated as external control on Egyptian chronology, or merely one data source among many?
Well, I would say that the Bible's history is infallible, so that its chronology is trustworthy. But when we recognize the incredible level of historical accuracy in the biblical narrative itself, we can look out into history and see how it does line up with secular history beautifully. And it's only the assumptions that are made in much older history, going back, through the judges and the period of Israel in Egypt, and before that back to Babel and the flood. That's been thrown out as real history. But when you take those into account, then the Bible lines up with archaeology and history very beautifully. So yeah, we got to start with the Bible and work out from there. But of course, people will say, "Oh, you're biased," and I would say, "Well, so are you, but you just don't know what your bias is." As Ken Ham used to say, "What is the best bias to be biased with?" And I'd say, the best bias to be biased with is the Bible. And if you start there with as your chronological framework, with your foundation, then everything will line up.
What do you think critics misunderstand most about biblical revisionist chronologies? Like in terms of your position, in terms of uh, um, uh, understanding Egyptian chronology with biblical chronology, when you tackle this subject matter with critics, what do you think that they misunderstand the most about it?
I really think it's down to worldview, that they just don't want the Bible to be true. Because if the Bible's true, then the God of the Bible is true. And he's the one that judges your sin. And they don't want to change their lifestyle. And it also means that, they've written books based on wrong thinking. So their entire careers are being challenged. So they don't want to go down that road. So most Egyptologists don't touch the Bible. And, they have very jaded views of biblical history. They think that, because Christians think that the pharaoh of the Exodus is Ramesses II. There's no evidence, and they would be correct in saying that. If you go to the period of Ramesses II, do the archaeology, there's no evidence for Semitic peoples in Egypt, but there is evidence for Semitic peoples in Egypt in the first half of the 18th dynasty, as Manfred Beitek has discovered in his archaeological digs in Avaris for the last 25 years. And the things that they found there, when you compare it with the narrative in Genesis, is stunning. There's no question that they have found evidence for Joseph and his brothers in ancient Egypt, the 12 tombs there, the statue wearing a multicolored coat, what they found in the dwellings of Semitic peoples, their lifestyle, the fact that they left in a hurry. It all starts to line up when you recognize that the Hyksos was Semitic pharaohs that ruled during that time, and they would have been quite happy to make a fellow Semite a ruler in Egypt. But there would be no other time in Egyptian history when a native Egyptian pharaoh would have allowed a foreigner to be next to him ruling. That's just out of the question. So if that pharaoh was Ramesses II, it becomes an absolute fairy tale. There's no way that Ramesses II or any native Egyptian pharaoh would have allowed a foreigner to become a ruler. And the way that the pharaoh speaks in the Bible as well is not like in a native Egyptian. So when Pharaoh has his dreams interpreted by Joseph, he says, "In whom a man can be found the Spirit of God like this man." Now, a native Egyptian would never speak like that. He was the representative God on earth. He upheld Ma'at, the rule of the gods over creation. Only a Semitic pharaoh ruler would talk about one God and the Spirit of God. So these are Semitic terms. And it makes sense also when Joseph brought his brothers to meet Pharaoh, and he said, "Don't tell him that you're shepherds," or rather, what he said was, "Don't mention that you're shepherds in the Pharaoh's court, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. They actually worship sheep, and so to kill sheep would have been obnoxious to them." But the Semites were were themselves shepherds. And so when his brothers blurted out and forgot what Joseph said, "Oh, by the way, we're shepherds." And he said, "Oh, fine, you can keep my flocks and my herds in the best part of the land." And so he didn't bat an eyelid. But his Egyptian courtiers, there would have been Egyptians that would have been helping the Hyksos pharaohs at the time. And one of them would have been Potiphar, and he's actually called an Egyptian in the text, which seems a bit redundant. If they're all Egyptians, why does the writer actually single him out as an Egyptian? So that makes a lot of sense. And after the Hyksos period, after that intermediate period, you get the native Egyptian rule coming back in, and that would be the pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And so they would have treated the Israelites as foreigners. It would have gone back to the status quo, and they would have been forced into slavery. So it makes perfect sense when you line up that period of Egyptian history, the Hyksos following the New Kingdom.
Right. Since you're, I had this as a later question, but I'll go ahead and ask it since you're already on the topic matter. Who would you argue that is the actual pharaoh during the Exodus, during the time of the Exodus?
Yeah, probably Tutmosis III. He's probably a good candidate. And interestingly, the names in that period include Mose, which is identical to Moses. So possibly Moses would have had a what we call a theophoric element at the end of his name. So he might have been a Moses Horus, or had an Egyptian god's name after his Mose. But he would have cut that out and just kept the first part of his name, which actually is a pun on drawn out of the water. So that sounds a lot like the Hebrew there. But there are several pharaohs during that period that all had the name Mose, which means born of or son of, and that would have been a son of a particular god. So it lines up again with the Egyptian history in that period of time. Tutmosis III probably is the pharaoh of the Exodus.
Awesome. All right. Is resistance to chronological revision primarily evidential or institutional or methodology? What is the reason that resistance to what would be the resistance that you would see that you're appealing to? Is it evidential, institutional, or methodological? What would you say is the issue?
I would say it's institutional. So we're talking about paradigm shifting. Was it James Kuhn, this philosophy of science? He talked about how paradigms change, and it's not about the evidence, it's actually about the status quo. And science moves on one funeral after another, to put it crassly. The old guard have to die out, basically, to allow for new thinking. And the old guard have to protect the status quo because they've written books, they protect the university chair, the money flows in, and if they rock the boat, then all that starts to fall apart. But it's only until younger scholars come in with new thinking that the status quo can change and the new paradigm comes in. But at the end of the day, when it comes to biblical history, it's the Bible you're talking about. So people are naturally hostile to the Bible because you're talking about the God of the Bible. And it's across all of the sciences, across all of the social sciences as well, that you can't allow the God of the Bible room. You can't allow the designer a foothold, because if you do, then you're basically admitting, God of the Bible's true. That means I'm not my own God. That means I'm responsible for my own sin. I'm responsible to my creator. So if the creator is real, then he sets the rules, and I better start living my life by his rules rather than my rules. And that's a big shift for anybody to make. So
Right.
it's
Here's a
institutional.
question. Here's a question that came in from my own channel. He asked me to ask it. I told him I would ask it verbatim, quote exactly what he said, because this is how he words it. Okay, question from my own channel. His name, he goes by the name Graham. If he, talking about you, Gavin, has any actual scientific, he puts it in all caps, scientific evidence to support truncating the Egyptian timeline.
Yeah, my
I
entire
tried to explain to him before the difference in history and science, but he still wants to know if you have any scientific evidence for it.
my entire talk was about that tonight. That Manetho treated the king lists uncritically. You cannot do that. Egyptologists know that the king lists, you cannot form a reliable chronology by king lists alone. So the kings writing the king lists, they could have been biased against other pharaohs, other leaders, and left them out. And there are different king lists that are contradictory, and they don't come with dates, and they don't tell you whether certain pharaohs ruled consecutively or concurrently. So when it comes to building a reliable chronology, the further you go back, the more difficult it is. And great Egyptologists like Alan Gardner and Kenneth Kitchen, they're very honest in their assessment to say that uncritical treatment of Manetho will actually get you nowhere. What's been trumpeted as Egyptian history by the media, by these documentaries, is much less reliable than we're constantly told. So, yes, we have plenty of scientific evidence to support truncating the Egyptian timeline. When we recognize that, particularly in the second intermediate, the first intermediate periods, there are periods of political turmoil where there were not just one pharaoh over the country. There would have been a pharaoh in the north and the south, maybe in the middle. And so they weren't reigning consecutively, they were reigning concurrently. So that immediately starts to concertina the Egyptian history if you think that they ran consecutively. And again, if you base your dates on radiocarbon dating, that is full of assumptions as well. It's just naturalism. It's just methodological naturalism, an assumption that the present is the key to the past. Well, actually, the past is the key to the present. If you don't understand that there was a flood, a supernatural creation, then your history is out of whack.
Right.
So,
Which
yeah,
Egyptian?
even secular
Go ahead.
historians, even secular Egyptologists, recognize that Egyptian history is changing. It's in flux, and it can be compressed. So you have no excuse not to understand that.
Which Egyptian dynasties do you argue were contemporaneous rather than sequential, and what evidence most strongly supports that?
Well, I just mentioned the intermediate periods. So they're periods of political instability, and there's evidence that there were multiple pharaohs, multiple rulerships. So if your big pharaoh of the whole country gets knocked out, then there will be rival leadership in the country. And the further south you go, there would have been different parts of the country that would have been ruled by other rulers. But all of this is still being worked out. So to assume that there was consecutive rule throughout ancient Egypt is completely wrong. You cannot assume that. So if you do assume that,
Right.
then your chronology is extended. So when you recognize that, periods of intermediate period, the two intermediate periods there, and particularly the Old Kingdom as well, there's far less archaeological remains to form a rock-solid chronology in the Old Kingdom and pre-dynastic periods. So the evidence is
Right.
not rock-solid.
Right. You mentioned pottery as well in your presentation. Are pottery typology and geography reliable enough to anchor absolute dates, or are they circularly dependent on assumed chronologies?
It's circular evidence to a certain degree. I mean, there will be pockets of history where you can form a reliable chronology through pottery, but then to try and extend that, you'll run into problems. And it also depends whether you found all the pottery in the first place, because Dame Kenyon, when she did her archaeology of Jericho, she did a lot of her work on pottery, and she said that because there was a certain pottery not found at Jericho, that the evidence for the period in which Israel was supposed to have come into Canaan was suspect. But then later they actually found this particular pottery that she said wasn't there, and it was found in a richer quarter of the city where more elite people could afford this particular type of pottery. And because she hadn't dug there, she hadn't found it. And so she made a lot of assumptions and therefore said that the fall of Jericho predated what the Bible allowed when Israel came into Canaan. And she based a lot of this on carbon dating, which was very young during that time when she was using carbon dating. And so they've now found the correct pottery that lines up with the biblical period of when Israel came into Canaan. And so it's up for grabs. It depends what you find in the ground, and you can find things later after archaeological reports that will then contradict the archaeological reports.
Right. How do you respond to the claim that your proposed compression would collapse established archaeological sequences?
Well, secular scholars recognize that. So if Egyptian chronology is overextended, then you'll get periods of history when you compare it to other ancient Near East culture that make it appear as though nothing's going on. And that's not what history is like. So that was the basic premise of Robert Morcott and Peter James's book, Centuries in Darkness. So, I mean, they're secular scholars. They don't have an axe to grind, and they recognize that Egyptian chronology is overextended at certain periods. And because of that, if you tie your ancient Near East chronologies to ancient Egypt, then those periods in other ancient Near East histories tend to look as though they're overextended as well. So there's periods when absolutely nothing is going on. So that was the title. It's a bit of a pun, Centuries of Darkness, where nothing was going on. So when you concertina when you collapse that Egyptian history, then it lines up with all the other ancient Near East histories as well. And you can do that through the synchronies with Egyptian rulers and other rulers in other ancient Near East cultures, Sumerian, Babylonian, Greek. So when you find these synchronizations, then you can start to form a reliable chronology.
Right.
So
Let's talk
it's
about
not just biblical history. It's not just biblical history that's up for grabs. It's the entire ancient Near East that it affects.
right. Let's talk about radiocarbon dating. I'm not gonna go too much into this. I discussed this with experts on my channel before, like with Dr. John Baumgartner. I had him on not too long ago discussing carbon dating or radiocarbon, because actually that's actually a friend of YAC positions actually. But we're not gonna get too much into that. But relevant to this discussion though. What role does radiocarbon dating actually play in Egyptian chronology, and where do you think it is overtrusted?
The further you go back in ancient history, when these dates are used uncritically, so the James Hoch pyramid studies back in 1984-85, they found that their dating of the Khufu pyramids was off by about 400 years. And they found that the reed and the wood that they use was probably recycled from earlier periods. So there was contamination. But that there's also assumptions mixed in with that. And I kind of outlined that in my talk when I talked about the decaying Earth's magnetic field. And I'm sure if you had John Baumgartner on, he would have talked about that as well. So again, if you don't take that into account, and generally they don't, I don't ever hear of any radiocarbon labs taking into account the Earth's magnetic field decreasing at the measurable and observable rate that it is. And so the further you go back, the stronger the magnetic field, the less carbon-14 would be produced. Therefore, your ratio would look older the further you go back. And also, if you don't take into account the flood, with a massive turnover of carbon-12 into the biosphere there, that would have changed the ratio completely. So it's the assumption that there is a steady state in the biosphere, which is incorrect. So there would have been a vastly different ratio the further you go back, according to the decreasing magnetic field and the floods implications.
I've actually mentioned that to critics before as well about the EM field weakening over time, and it would have been stronger in the past, which means less C14 produced, and that would actually throw off the C12 C14 ratio, and so that would actually impact dating the further back you go. It's more reliable, like you said in your presentation. It's more reliable the closer you get to the present.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that things like ancient fossils, dinosaur bones, dinosaur soft tissue as well, contain carbon, a ratio carbon-14 and carbon-12, which looks very modern. And diamonds, even diamonds, contain carbon-14, far above the threshold limit for the accelerator mass spectrometers that they use. So, you know, the ratio in carbon-14 to carbon-12 in diamonds, there should be no carbon-14 in diamonds, but there is a measurable amount. That means those diamonds are not millions or billions of years old, but only thousands of years. And going back in the literature for 30, 40 years, it's been known that there is carbon-14 at every level of the geological record. So in ancient samples, when I say ancient, supposedly millions and billions of years, marble, coal, oil, gas, all manner of fossils, it's been reported for the last 30 or 40 years in the secular literature that there is measurable amounts of carbon-14. So the ratio makes it look young. But they always try and argue that away as, oh, it must be modern contamination. But when you look at diamonds, which is what the rate project looked at, they measured the ratio. They didn't measure it. They sent it off to secular labs who did the measurements, and they found carbon-14 in these diamonds way above the error calibration of the machines that they were using. So it cannot be modern contamination. In other words, the carbon-14 they found in those diamonds is inherent to the diamond. It was there when it was created. So it couldn't have been created a billion or half a billion years ago. It was only created thousands of years ago. So
The next question I have is an interesting one. This one I hear a lot. People bring up what they call calibration curves,
yeah,
how do calibration curves, sample selection, historic anchoring affect the reliability of C14 dates for dynastic Egypt? And we'll bring up tree ring dating and things like that. And they use what they call calibration curves and to try to line that up. How does
yeah.
that? Well, what was your answer to that question?
Well, again, there's so many variables. There's so many assumptions being made that I think the results are extremely spurious, and you have to buy into the dates anyway for it to work. So a lot of these tree ring dating that they extend and extend and extend are not based on any tree. They found bits of wood in the vicinity, and they've looked at the tree rings and they think, oh, that lines up with these tree rings, so we can go back and go back and go back. But it's all in the eye of the beholder at the end of the day. And some of the parts of the radiocarbon curve cannot be calibrated. It's called the Hallstatt disaster plateau, and it occurs particularly in around 700 to 1400 BC, and it particularly affects the time of David and Solomon, unfortunately. So there's parts of the radiocarbon curve that cannot and ever will be calibrated, and that could have been disturbances in Earth's magnetic field. Who knows? But there are parts of the known radiocarbon curve that will not calibrate. And so if that's true of certain fixed dates in history, who knows what's going on in even older periods that supposedly predate history. So it's a lot of circular reasoning. There's a lot of assumptions, a lot of in the eye of the beholder when it comes to these extended dates based on tree ring analysis and various things like that.
There is a star that sometimes people use on Egyptian chronology called Sothis or something like that. Sothis. Um, when Egyptologists appeal to the helical rising of Sothis,
Yeah.
Sothis, if I pronounced that correctly, which assumptions are they making before any dates are actually calculated? Explain to everybody what exactly that is. What is the argument, and what is your response to that?
The heliacal rising of Sothis. So they're trying to tie, if you take a computer model of the the solar system and the stars, you can plug that in and you can get regular risings of stars. And so, that will form time periods. And so there are certain texts in ancient Egypt that scholars assume are talking about these stars, but they might not be in many cases. So a lot of these are actually assumptions about these stars' heliacal risings, and so there are assumptions being made there. And actually, this idea is pretty much passé in modern scholarship now. It's kind of gone by the way, and so people don't rely on it anymore.
All right. And would you agree that Celtic dating is not a direct observation, but a reconstruction event depending on modern astronomical modeling?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's all based on a computer program, and you're just extending that into unobserved history and assuming that when there are Egyptian texts that are talking about stars that are rising, that it must be talking about Sothis, when it might not be at all. So there's a lot of assumptions being made, and if any Google search, you can find that there are scholars that are saying no, it's not a science, it's more of an art, and it's probably a very inaccurate art as well.
The next question I have written, I think you basically are on answering that, but how often is Celtic dating treated as an anchor when methodologically it should function as a constraint? So essentially, is this something that they use quite often? But you saying that people are now not using that as much, or what exactly are you saying there?
I'm unaware that it's being used at all these days. It was a
Right.
fashion, but it's not fashionable now, I don't think.
Okay. Um, okay. I've got some more questions on Celtis, but if it's not really being used much, we could probably skip a lot of them. Um, well, I'll ask a few more. Since the helical rising of Solaris varies by latitude, how confident can we be when the ancient texts never state where the observation occurred?
Hmm.
Um, so I guess this is a lack of evidence in the historical record, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you you can have an Egyptian text that talks about stars and stars rising, but are they actually referring to the stars that are in the model? So you're trying to link two things together and making big assumptions, and according to your assumptions, you'll calculate the dates. But if it's not stated in the text, in the Egyptian text itself, then you can be completely wrong. That's why I don't think it's particularly taken seriously anymore.
All right. Um, okay, let's go to calendar assumptions. How certain are we that Egypt's 365 days civil calendar was never adjusted, intercalculated, or locally modified? How
Oh
confident
gosh.
would we be that would not be altered?
Well, the calendar did go out of sync, and so they added into calorie days. That's well known that the civil and the religious calendar went out of sync quite regularly, and so they would have had to have adjusted it. But I can't honestly say that this is my strong point. I didn't particularly come genned up to talk about it tonight.
That's fine. Um, okay, it's just one of the questions I have on there. Um, let's see. Um, sorry, I'm looking. I got a lot of questions on Salt Lake. I'm trying to skip over a lot of them, save us some time. Uh, all right. Let's talk about the Exodus. In your model, where does the Exodus best fit within Egyptian history?
It makes sense to have it sort of towards the end of the 18th dynasty. That's when so you had the intermediate period there with the Semitic pharaohs, the Hyksos, being friendly to the Israelites and Joseph and his family. And then after that period, you have the native Egyptian pharaohs ruling and reigning, and you'd have had enough time for Israel to expand as a nation. And that's when we would say that that's the best period to have the Exodus. Tutmosis III, and you get Hatshepsut was probably the stepmother who looked after Moses. And interestingly, her name was being hacked out of her temples, and her name was being hacked out whenever it was found. So there was something about her that the Egyptians absolutely found unforgiving, and it could well be that she was the one that looked after Moses. So after that period, you get Akhenaten, who comes on the throne, and he says, "Well, it seems that the Egyptian old order and all the gods can't be trusted anymore. We better get back to this idea of one God." And he goes for the solar god, which is interesting, isn't it? Because all of the the plagues were against the gods, and that was what God's purpose was, to demonstrate to the Egyptians and the Pharaoh that he was the one true God, and all of their pantheon were actually no gods at all and couldn't control nature. So it makes sense that after the plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea, that would have had a tremendous psychological impact on Egypt as a nation. And it makes sense that Akhenaten's reign would take that into account and recognize, yeah, the Egyptian gods were beaten. But then his son, Tutankhamun, he went back to the old order and back to the old gods. So he wasn't there to actually experience the plagues or the splitting of the Red Sea and the one true God. So I think when you actually see all those patterns of evidence lining up, it makes a lot of sense to have the Exodus in that period.
How do you interpret the? I know that you talked about this a little bit. How do you interpret the lack of explicit Egyptian record of the Exodus? Does that count against the event historically? What would you say to someone who says, "Well, there's just no evidence for Egyptian or the Israelites um, being here and the event of the Exodus actually happening." That's probably a common attack you probably heard of.
Mhm. Well, the Egyptians never boasted about their defeats. Even when they were defeated in battle, they spun it somehow so to make them look good. So they wouldn't write on their walls and their temples, "Oh yeah, we were beaten by a foreign god, and all these Egyptian pharaoh slaves, they trounced us." Yeah, that's not just how Egyptians thought. Um, the pharaoh was always victorious, no matter what happened. He always maintained Ma'at, the balance between nature and the gods. But
In
when,
Egyptian mythology, they considered pharaohs to be God on earth. Isn't that right?
yeah, the representative of God on earth, yeah, Horus or Osiris when he goes back to the underworld.
Okay, we've already talked about who was the pharaoh during that. Event. All right. Here's some stuff on Joseph. Do you see a plausible historical placement for Joseph within the Egyptian administration, and if so, under which dynasty?
Again, it could only have occurred during the Hyksos period. That's the Semitic pharaohs. They weren't a native Egyptian pharaohs. So it makes sense that a Semitic pharaoh would have been open to their fellow cousins to be a ruler in Egypt and have the best land for their families. That's the only period in Egyptian history when that could have happened.
On this Egyptian timeline, as far as compressed with the biblical timeline, how does that affect synchronisms with Mesopotamian, Levantine, or Hittite chronologies? Does it fit pretty well with those particular histories? I know we have stuff, archaeological discoveries concerning the Hittites.
Yeah, I mean this is sort of Moses period, isn't it? And scholars have seen a lot of interesting connections with the covenant and the structure of the covenant and the structure of Deuteronomy, and how Moses wrote. So we recognize that Moses was taught in all the ways of Egypt, and Egypt would have been in correspondence with the Mesopotamians and the Hittites, and so Moses would have understood, the writings and how to compose and how to compose a covenant. And so Egypt was making covenants with the Hittites at that period, and so that covenant structure, scholars have identified in with the covenant that has been written for Israel. So there's a lot of crossovers there, and once the Hittites were not even believed by scholars. They said, "Oh, the Bible's talking about the Hittites. There's no evidence for the Hittites in the archaeological record." And then, lo and behold, they find Hittite writings and a Hittite city, and it's all there, just where the Bible says it would be, and at the right period.
Right. That is awesome. Yes, indeed. Um, do you see Egyptian chronology as the linchpin holding other ancient timelines in place? And if so, what happens when it shifts?
Well, when the Egyptian timeline shifts, anything else does as well, because everything else tends to be tied to the Egyptian timeline. So if it's overextended, and all the other ancient Near East cultures are overextended as well, so they just go for the Egyptian chronology because there's so much archaeology there that talks about kings and reigns, and it's all written in stone, so we assume that it's all accurate. But there's so many shifting lines, if you like, that need to be sorted out, which affects everything else if you tie your chronology to Egyptian chronology.
If your chronology is broadly correct, what does it imply about the reliability of the biblical historical record? What would you say that this? Would you say that this would imply? I guess maybe that the biblical record can be trusted and is infallible. That we don't necessarily have to interpret Egyptian history in light of secular views about the past. How would you understand this?
Well, there's so much chronological information in the Bible. I mean, it's chock full. That's why you can't say that the Bible is just full of stories. There's so much chronological information in the Bible, and biblical chronologists have formed a very reliable chronology of the kings of Judah and Israel, and So you can form Edwin Teale, the chronologist, he formed a very accurate chronology of the Bible. And because of those rulers, the Judean kings and the Israelite kings, they had correspondences with pharaohs, with other rulers in the ancient Near East. You can start your synchronisms there and actually date things in the rest of the ancient Near East to the biblical history. And so when you compare the histories of the other ancient kings, there's a lot more history in the Bible that's going on there. And so I'd say, yeah, the biblical chronology is very reliable.
Do you think future discoveries are more likely to confirm the conventional timeline or force further compression? I'm thinking probably the later. That the more we know, the more it's going to be more showing the Bible to be correct on
Yeah.
the timeline.
Hmm. And particularly the more ancient histories as well. There's less archaeology that has survived, so it's more natural to understand that the later Egyptian history is far more accurate. But again, how much these dynasties overlap, um, you know 18, 19, 20, 21st dynasties, they can overlap too much. And so I would say it's at the death of a thousand cuts. There's a lot of work to be done that will you know f- focus in on how much the Egyptian timeline needs to be compressed during these periods. But when the further you go back into the intermediate periods in the Old Kingdom, when there's much less uncertainty, you can make your big cuts there. And I think history and time will tell that Egyptian history can be compressed.
All right. What advice would you give to Christians engaging Egyptology without either dismissing the data or subordinating scripture? I mean, what would you obviously wouldn't want them to sit there and put scripture aside. You would want to see that that is very, very important to a Christian in terms of how they are understanding the past and the history. Um, but at the same time, you don't want to just simply dismiss the data. And so when Christians are looking at the evidence and the data and doing so from a biblical perspective, what advice would you give them on how to understand all this?
Mm. Trust your Bible, and that's the best place to start. Um, I mean, I've not really spoken about all the discoveries that have been made in Israel over the last few decades, that have really highlighted very minor names in the Old Testament. So you get various scribes that are just mentioned in a particular verse to do with biblical kings, and their seals have been discovered. Um, Tremendous discoveries that have been constantly being made that just back up the history in the Bible and the narratives of Scripture. And so, whenever you read of a scholar saying, "Oh, there's no evidence for this or that," you can almost uh, place a bet that in the next few years there'll be an archaeologist that will actually dig up something that actually shows that that period of the Bible is absolutely accurate and as written. So, don't give up on the history in the Bible.
When you were talking about the Pharaoh during the Exorcist, would you talk about Tutmos the third? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
You,
I just
you
wanted
can
to make
see it
sure I was right.
written in there, his name, Mose, and the thoth there is the theophoric element, the divine element. And so Moses would have dropped that and just kept that part of his name and made a pun on it because it sounds like Hebrew being drawn out of water. But Moses, when he was in Pharaoh's court, would have likely had a theophoric element attached to his name.
Right. There don't seem to be any questions in the chat. Lynn said that we answered all her questions. So, and I think one didn't know that much about the topic matter to answer the questions or ask a question. Um, um, but he said that he had to go anyhow. But so unfortunately, we don't have no questions in the chat. But we did. It was very comprehensive. I had a lot of questions myself, and your presentation was awesome. I do want to ask one more question before you go. Um, what is your overall conclusion from all this? Do you see strong evidence and reasons that the chronology should be taken over the secular chronological dates?
Yeah, I mean the secular dates are shifting, and Egyptologists themselves know their trade secret that Egyptian history isn't as advertised. And so you get the documentaries and the PBS programs and natural history and History Channel, and they'll give a colourful presentation of what is not the case, that any new find can actually rewrite history. And so if your history is that unreliable that any new find can actually rewrite it, then what are you basing your thinking upon? And I would say go back to the Bible, base your thinking upon that, and you won't go far wrong.
Absolutely. Um, thank you for joining us on here. Do you have any final thoughts to leave everybody with before you go?
Well, just that Jesus Christ himself upheld the Bible as historically reliable. He never questioned Moses whenever it came to the early periods of history and the implications for humankind. You know, Adam and Eve being made at the beginning of creation. The flood was a historical global event. You know, Jesus treated those as historical, as well as all the New Testament writers. So Hebrews and Peter and the Apostle Paul, very important. Adam and Eve were the first created humans who fell, and that's when sin and suffering and death and bloodshed came into the good, perfect creation that God made. And all of us are contaminated with that sin. And we all have a sin nature, therefore, we all face suffering and death, which are not part of God's perfect, good creation. But God didn't leave it there. He took on human flesh. He stepped into creation, that fallen creation, to redeem it back to himself. And so if we come to Christ Jesus as our Savior and Lord and recognize him as our Creator because he is Lord, then our relationship with our Creator can be restored, and we can look forward to a brand new creation where there's no more death or suffering, and that's all done away with. And only in Christ Jesus can we look forward to a full salvation. And so if you're thinking about the claims of the Bible and the claims of Christianity tonight, I would say keep looking and step out in faith and ask Jesus Christ to be your Lord and Savior, because he is your Creator who redeemed you. So the history in the Bible is true. It can be trustworthy, and you can trust the future in the Bible and the theology and the truth that is founded upon that history. So I think with those closing thoughts, I'll hand back to you, Brian.
Amen. Amen. Thank you again for joining us on here. Thank you again for the presentation and for answering questions. That was awesome. I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys out there also enjoyed it and got something from this. I had a few people that they've given me some feedback that this has been an awesome discussion. So again, thank you again, Gavin, and I appreciate it. And God bless.
God bless. Thanks for having me.